If the Pelicans want to do anything in free agency, they're going to need to get creative. Well, I've got 3 perfect targets and how the Pelicans get them. It's Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with you on this Tuesday, and we've got quite the show. We're going to skip forward to free agency and 3 sign-in trade targets for the New Orleans Pelicans. Guys that I think do make sense on this team, but also the limitations they're going to have means you've got to get creative. Well, I got creative, and here's how they could get one of these 3 players and why the players make sense for New Orleans. So we're going to cover free agency and some trades in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. And if you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. So we're going to assume a couple of things here for this exercise that you're on the journey with me, are about to do. Number 1, the Pelicans are keeping Zion. Maybe they end up waiving him. Maybe he ends up getting traded. Maybe they don't do anything with that. But for now, he's on the team. So let's assume that they are building behind him going forward. Number 2, that they're willing to pay the luxury tax. This might be the biggest stretch there is. But let's say they can go into the tax in these sorts of deals. You can always duck it later and get out of it at the NBA trade deadline. But here's the thing. They can't go that deep into it because the Pelicans will be hard capped in any of these deals at the first apron. So that's kind of the upper limit of salary here. If you do acquire a player in a sign-in trade, you are hard capped at the first apron. That's no big deal. They wouldn't go beyond that anyway. As it stands right now with Elfrid Payton, Brandon Boston Jr. on the roster and an open pick, right? They have about $11 million to the first apron. You could get rid of Elfrid Payton and it puts you at about right around $14 million from the first apron. So that's how much wiggle room they have to add additional salary. So if you're trading a guy, say you trade away Trey Murphy just to make the numbers easy because he's making $25 million this year, you could bring someone back making $39 million or find a way to kind of make that happen. You get what I'm saying. You could add $14 million onto their books essentially, and it would be okay here. Not entirely because you still need to then fill out the roster, but around that. So they have some wiggle room, but not above the first apron, which is $196 million basically in salary. So let's get into the players. And I want to start with Naz Reid. This is someone that's brought up a lot as an ideal target for New Orleans. And on one side of it, yeah, I agree. He's a big man that can play power forward, center, and shoots the threes, court spacing 3, right? Like that's exactly what you really need from this team that they have not really been able to put around Zion Williamson, at least not a high level one, right? Like they've put Carlo Makovich around him. They put Kelly Olynyk around Zion, but it's not the player of a Naz Reid who just 2 years ago now won 6th Man of the Year. And last season for Minnesota, he averaged 14.2 points per game, 6 rebounds, along with 2.3 assists, while shooting 38% from 3. The year that he won 6th Man of the Year was 41% from 3 on over 5 attempts per game. So when you look at it, yeah, like this guy is who you want. He's got a player option for $15 million this coming season, but he's likely to opt out of that, I think, and at least get a longer-term contract when it comes down to it. There's not a ton of cap space, right? I've gone over that. Really, there's only one team with functional cap space, and that's the Brooklyn Nets. So it's not like there's big paydays for anyone in free agency. This is why I've long said you don't really see big-name players change teams purely in free agency by just signing with another team. It needs to be sign-in trades, and teams have been shown they're willing to help facilitate that sort of thing. So, but there could be a squeeze, and maybe when we get into what his contract would look like, it drops a little bit because of that kind of squeeze around the league. So Naz Reid makes, I think, a lot of sense for this team. He would be an instant starter for you. The rumors are that he wants, more of a larger role, maybe not to be a six man. He wants to be a starter, right? Well, he could definitely do that here in New Orleans. I think this is a player who is looking like he's going to make $22 to $25 million annually on a 3 to 4 year deal, somewhere in that range, right? I would not be shocked if 4 years, $100 million is exactly where he is, basically an average annual value of $25 million. It would start a little bit less than that, probably start around $22 million and eventually escalate up. But that's what I could see him getting. And I think that's probably about right for his value. So here's the trade. This one's a little bit complicated because the Timberwolves are not in a great spot, right? The Pelicans don't have $22 million to go and sign him out, right? So again, it has to be a sign and trade. Here's the sign and trade that I proposed for Naz Reid. Would be something like CJ McCollum for Naz Reid and Mike Conley. And that's a way to make the numbers work right there. If you're kind of starting Naz Reid's first year at, let's call it $23.5 million. So split the difference between that 22-25 I think that he can receive right in there. You add in Mike Conley's like $10 million deal. One, the Pelicans get a point guard they need. The Minnesota Timberwolves get some more shooting and get a guy that can run point a little bit for you, while also still giving more room for guys like Rob Dillingham and some of the others to really start to kind of come into their own. And then the other thing that this does, it gives them a big expiring contract. That team is expensive. They are pushing the second apron with everything. That's not a great spot to be in. And this at least gets you some expiring contract that if it comes off your books in the future is going to be able to really help you by giving you that breathing room that you need. So New Orleans kind of addresses two things. You get a starting point guard and you get Naz Reid to be your starting center, even though he kind of splits his time between center and power forward. But here's the thing. I'm not exactly sure he is the perfect guy to put into this roster. One of the big issues with New Orleans was they were a terrible rebounding team last year. Naz Reid is a fine enough defensive rebounder, but not elite at it in any sort of sense, right? His defensive rebounding rate is around 19%. Jonas Valanciunas was like 30 and above, 28% and above. This is a pretty significant drop there. His defensive rebounding rate, let me pull it and compare it to some of the other people on the team, right? Yves Missi was 19.7. Naz Reid last year was 19.3. So he's about the same level of rebounder that Missi is. So adding Naz Reid in doesn't fix the rebounding issue for New Orleans. That's worth keeping in mind here. The other way that you could see him, maybe not being the best fit is, he's not a traditional big man, and he's a little bit undersized at 6'9". He's not an elite defender or even a good defender, in my opinion. He's not a shot blocker. So that prevents you from kind of plugging that hole too. And the way his offensive game is, beyond just shooting the threes, he wants to take people off the dribble, from the perimeter. He's not like a traditional back to the basket post up big. He often plays a little bit like a guard, similar to Zion Williamson. While that's useful, and you could get him and Zion attacking downhill, and that's kind of fun while, Reid can space the court. If you need that kind of post presence, a lob threat, that's not Naz Reid. That's not his game. But the Pelicans could do worse to address the big man situation and add him into the rotation here. And I think it's an option that they could definitely take while also getting you kind of off of CJ's contract and allowing you to fill two holes. Let me know what you think about that trade in the comments down below. So coming up next, what about taking a flyer on someone like Jonathan Kuminga and his continued development? Let's look at what a deal like that would be and why maybe he's the right guy to go after if you're the New Orleans Pelicans. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by OpenPhone. If you're running a business, you know that every missed call is money left on the table. So think about the last time you had an urgent need, maybe for a plumber, service provider. If they didn't answer the phone, did you wait? Probably not. You moved on, right? That's why you need OpenPhone. This literally happened to me over the weekend where I needed something done quickly, like needed a repairman. I called two places, they didn't answer, and I just kept moving on to the third till I found someone who answered the phone. So OpenPhone is the number one a business phone system built to streamline and scale your customer communications, all from an app on your phone or computer. So OpenPhone is going to let you manage business calls and texts from a single app, and the shared inbox is a game changer. Your team can jump into any conversation instantly without missing a beat. They also have an AI call agent that can handle things after hours for you. So OpenPhone is offering Locked On Pelicans listeners 20% off your first 6 months at openphone.com/LockedOnNBA. That's openphone.com/LockedOnNBA. And if you have existing numbers with another service, OpenPhone will port them over at no extra charge. OpenPhone, no missed calls, no missed customers. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the number one Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everyday. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans podcast. We've been doing a lot of like CBA and salary cap talk. Can't get that anywhere. And we've got all the numbers and everything for you and why that's important with looking at free agency and things like that and how, if you want Naz Reid, you've got to get creative for it. Knowing about the first apron and how the Pelicans will be hard capped at that, that's an important thing to look at as well. So make sure you're listening. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NBA Big Board Show. NBA draft expert Rafael Barlow reacts to every workout, interview, and rumor leading up to the NBA draft. Find Locked On NBA Big Board on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we just looked at a big man that could really kind of like fix New Orleans, stabilize New Orleans in a sense, I think. But what if that's not the direction, or what if Naz Reid isn't available? And maybe you want someone with, let's call it like more upside here. Jonathan Kuminga of the Golden State Warriors is in an interesting spot, like in and out of the rotation, starting, not starting for the team last year, dealt with injuries and stuff too. Just a weird season that he had, and at times looked to be their best offensive player, but they weren't playing him. And you've seen some growth from him. We'll get into that here in a second here, but overall, like a guy that if you want a young player that looks like he could get even better, makes a ton of sense. He'll be 23 years old next season and is a former 7th overall pick in the draft. Last year, he averaged 15.3 points per game, 4.6 rebounds, 2.2 assists, about a steal and half a block per game. Did not shoot well last year, 30.5% from three, not 35%, 30.5%. And only 45% from the field. But for his career, he's been better than that. 33% from three, 51% from the field. And he's an above average defender. He's hyper athletic too. Hyper athletic. And I think when you saw the Golden State Warriors playing teams like the Minnesota Timberwolves and others, like he was doing the best job of trying to defend a guy like Anthony Edwards and what have you. He's willing to take on those kind of assignments. You sign him in a sign and trade and put him with Trey and Herb, you have like this athletic, long wing group that could be a whole lot of fun to watch. But there's some limitations there too, right? He's not a good shooter. If Jonathan Kuminga could shoot in volume, he would be considered a top player around the league and everyone would be trying to get him, and he wouldn't be out of the Golden State Warriors lineup in any capacity, right? But that's just not who he has been, I think. But if you want someone with upside, someone that, maybe plays himself into more value that you could trade later, or if you end up, releasing Zion Williamson or trading Zion in a year, whatever happens with Zion Williamson, right? This is someone who could maybe take up some of that scoring load alongside Trey Murphy. And that makes sense to me. He's a wing, can play a little bit in the front court too, but this is a player that, has just upside. It's like the best way to look at it, I think, with, what he's done. And he's been in the Golden State Warriors system. That's an important thing where you kind of see how they do things, and bringing that to this team as, you're still a young guy, but you're a veteran at this point, would probably be pretty appealing for the New Orleans Pelicans. Per 36 minutes, last year was 22.6 points per game and almost 7 boards. Year before that, right? That's 22 points, 6.6 rebounds. All those numbers are good with like good defense. Again, if he can shoot, he can be a really elite player. Now, his game is not great still, right? It's a little herky-jerky at times and not in kind of the good way. And what he does well is just uses his athleticism to get into the paint and get to his spots and score, but he doesn't have the best handle. His decision-making has gotten better. He's cut down on some of the turnovers, but they're a little bit higher than you'd like. And he doesn't run an offense or things like that. He doesn't navigate screens really well as a ball handler, in my opinion. But again, young scorer, upside, you could always trade later. I think he's looking at a contract right around Trey Murphy's, which was 4 years, $112 million. So you're kind of looking, right around like $25 million is the starting number for him. And okay, that works. It's an average annual value of $28 million. That sounds about right for him. I don't think he's worth exactly that, but that's what it would take to kind of pry him away from the Golden State Warriors. This is where things get kind of interesting because Golden State's in a tough spot. They could lose him for nothing. And, though the only team that would really make them lose him for nothing is a team like the Brooklyn Nets. And I don't think there's been anything that really indicates that that's going to be the case here. He's also a restricted free agent. That's worth keeping in mind. Him and Santi Aldama, who we'll talk about next, are both restricted free agents. So if you kind of do an offer out there, then, they can match it. The other thing that makes this more complicated is if you make, the way free agency works is that they're a restricted free agent. The team has matching rights. If you make an offer, his incumbent team, the original team, has 3 days, 72 hours, I think it is, to match that offer. It can tie up your cap space, all that stuff. We don't worry about that right now. And the Pelicans can't really do that because they don't have the cap space to sign him. But if somehow they cleared room, and waiving Zion alone wouldn't do that. If they somehow cleared room, if you make him put an offer sheet in front of him and he signs it, and then you wait on the Golden State Warriors to match, they cannot then sign and trade him to the new team. It does not work like that. So the Warriors could then just match and then can't trade him to New Orleans. That's not really going to be a factor here, so I'm less worried about that. That could play a role in Santi Aldama, which we'll look at in the next segment. But restricted free agency makes this a little bit more complicated than it would be for someone like Naz Reid, who's not a restricted free agent. So the Warriors are in a tough spot because one, their salary, and two, their depth is just shot. It's gone. They have a bunch of free agents. I don't know how they're going to re-sign everybody. They need to add some players. So you're going to try and help them out with that in exchange for making this work. So Jonathan Kuminga at 4 years, $112 million, $25 million in that first year. Something like Kelly Olynyk, Carlo Makovich, and Brandon Boston Jr. going back to the Golden State Warriors in a signing trade for Jonathan Kuminga would work. Kelly Olynyk probably kind of replaces, I'm blanking on their center, who I'm trying to remember right now, Kevon Looney. That would really work. You get some scoring punch in Brandon Boston Jr. and just another, versatile big who's unproven in Carlo Makovich. That's the type of trade I think they could use. I looked at trying to send CJ there, but the numbers are really, really tough to make that work. You could probably do it with Jonathan Kuminga for CJ, but then you need to add something to it, and that's not an easy thing to do here. And that's adding a lot onto their books. It's not like $25 million for $30 million at that point because Kuminga's only making $7-8 million this year. So if all of a sudden you're signing and trading him, but you're adding CJ McCollum to this, you're upping their books by $23 million or something like that, essentially. I don't think that's something they can exactly do. So it would need to be like Kuminga and Draymond Green for CJ. And then you're just getting into such weird territory that we don't even need to waste time kind of talking about that. So it would need to be Kelly Olynyk, Brandon Boston Jr., Carlo Makovich to kind of keep it as close as possible to, dropping some of their salary, which is what they're going to be looking at, while also giving them some depth with not overdoing it and overloading them with salary. But I think that's a trade that could work with, New Orleans doesn't really have a problem giving up any of those three guys in this sort of deal. But maybe they don't need Kuminga. Where does he fit? Where does he play? Him not being a shooter and putting him next to Zion, does that really work? Probably not. It's if they wanted to just kind of make some sort of splash to make a splash, this is a move that I think would do it. But Kuminga, I'm not the highest on him. It just doesn't make a ton of sense, but I would be very curious how he would look in a much more expanded role with a higher usage rate, and if he'd be able to kind of become the shooter you hope he would be able to be. So I don't know how I feel about that one. Let me know what you think about Jonathan Kuminga in the comments down below. I'm actually genuinely curious what you all have to say. Let's get into maybe my favorite option out of all of these, and that's Santi Aldama from the Memphis Grizzlies. And I think of all the ones we're mentioning, he's maybe the most attainable. And it's pretty easy to make this work. Let's talk about how he would fit, what the contract would look like, and how to get a deal done. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is sponsored by Betterhelp. Let's talk about something we talked about enough, right? Men's mental health. There's this pressure to always keep it together, to perform, provide, never show weakness. But the truth is, strength comes from opening up and just taking care of yourself so you can actually be the best for others. Every year, 6 million men in the U.S. experience depression, and many go undiagnosed. So talking to someone, a friend, a loved one, a therapist can make a huge difference. And look, therapy isn't just for crisis moments. It's great for learning how to set boundaries, build healthy coping skills, and just be the best version of you. Look, I've used therapy a ton. I'm actively doing it right now, and it's great. You learn a lot about yourself and how to I feel like better than I ever had because I know how I operate a little bit more. I know what stresses me out and how I react to it. I can make adjustments according, and in those moments, they don't impact me as much once you learn that sort of stuff. And with over 35,000 licensed professionals, BetterHelp makes it easy to find a therapist who understands you. And you can connect from anywhere, which is what I love about it. You can do it. You don't need to go to an appointment, wait, go in, leave, drive, all of that. It just makes it super easy and convenient. So as the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. So talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/lockedonnba. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedonnba. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. For your second listen, Locked On Saints, they do these fun squad shows too, where they get some other experts, including Lance Moore, on their live to talk about the show. I don't know. Maybe you're in the street walking down Magazine, watching it live on your show. That was awesome. Shout out there. So please make Locked On Saints your second listen today, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So I want to get into a guy that has been kind of secretly, quietly, like maybe my top option for the New Orleans Pelicans for a while now. I've mentioned him on the show before during the season, and now it's the time to talk about him a little bit. And that's Santi Aldama from the Memphis Grizzlies. I can remember things. It's spaced out right there. He's a big man off the bench that has done some very good things. Young, 24 years, will be 25 next year too. 6'11". This is his fourth year in the league, and he's grown every single year. Last season, for Memphis in 65 games, 16 starts in 25 and a half minutes, 12.5 points per game, 6.4 rebounds, almost 3 assists, about a steal and half a block per, and he also shot 37% from 3. Those are all really good numbers, in my opinion, when it comes down to a player kind of doing that. Let's look at per 36-minute numbers, because all of these players would be taking a larger role with New Orleans. By the way, if you're kind of new to some of these stats, and we'll do a show on this, per 36 minutes, this is a little, not exactly the same as it used to be, but 36 minutes used to be kind of like the average number of minutes a starter played. So if you take a role player who doesn't start and put him into per 36 minutes, basically extrapolate the numbers out, that kind of gives you an idea of what they could be as a starter. It's not an exact science, obviously. Some players hit diminishing returns at a certain number of minutes, but it gives you a way to at least kind of compare apples to apples. So per 36 minutes this past season for Santi Aldama is 17.6 points per game, 9 rebounds and 4 assists, 1.1 steals, 0.6 blocks, 7.1 three-point attempts per game. Very good volume right there. And 2.6 makes, 37%. Those are really good counting stats. And hold on to that thought for a moment here. He's not someone that I think is going to be stupidly expensive. I think on the low end, he's probably looking at the full mid-level exception of $14 million a year. I think that's a reasonable number for him. I think he could get as high as $19 million. I think he's somewhere in that $14 to $19 million range. If that's what it is, you could straight up trade Kelly Olynyk for him. So, I mentioned having the cap space to sign him and those things, right? The Pelicans here could, in theory, try and use their whole mid-level exception to sign him. They would have that available, the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. One of the three. If you don't know what that is, there's a whole show on it from last week where we covered the salary cap and how it all works. This would work in a sense. You need to shave some salary because you only have that $11 million to the first apron line. So in theory, you could be like, we're just going to sign him outright with that. You could waive, Brandon Boston Jr., you could waive Elfrid Payton, and that gives you enough room to sign him, enough breathing room from the first apron. So you could just do that and threaten Memphis, like, we're just going to sign him. You're not going to get anything for him. Memphis probably is willing to let him go. But if you could get Kelly Olynyk in return, maybe that makes more sense to just kind of replace him, right? Kelly Olynyk does some of the same things that Santi Aldama does. So maybe that makes sense for them to do. And that's why I think they could be enticed into a sign-in trade here to make this sort of thing work. So Kelly Olynyk straight up for Santi Aldama, you don't need to give much. Hey, you want to play or not? And they could say no, and then you just sign him. Simple as that. So that kind of gets around some of the issues here, I think, in terms of the restricted free agency and all of that. So Kelly Olynyk straight up for Santi Aldama. Now, is he the perfect player? No. Some of the same concerns are here that we had for Naz Reid. He's just cheaper, right? And, still can grow and has grown. He's not a good defender, I wouldn't say. I don't think this is the type of guy that's ever going to be any sort of shot blocker. Both he and Naz Reid have lower block percentages than Yves Missi does. His defensive rebounding percentage is right around the same as Yves Missi as Naz Reid too. The thing is just Aldama shoots threes. He's kind of in the same vein of a player as Naz Reid, just maybe not as good, but cheaper, and that matters for the discussion here. So that's where I think he makes a lot of sense. Is if you look at the real, which one of these three guys is the most realistic, it's probably Aldama. And I think Memphis is willing to let him go. Also depends on what else happens during their off season. But I love the idea of trying him out, at least on the cheap relatively, and gives you kind of that versatile big that you're looking for. But I think you can get that one done pretty easily. Let me know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree in the comments down below? And that's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Pelicans. Those are my top 3 free agent sign-in trade targets. Is there someone I missed? Is there someone else that you think is realistic? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Appreciate y'all listening. We'll be back tomorrow. Probably talk a little bit more draft.